Book 13. Yet another book showing that many of the old pagan writers testify to the antiquity and the divine scriptures uttered through Moses and the prophets, and that the Greeks appear to have learned letters, the last of the Greeks appear to have learned letters last of all, and to have their unbelief with regard to the divine scriptures deeply rooted. In the Chaldean books of Berosus and certain others it is thus written, that 10 kings reigned over the Chaldean, 2242 myriads of years, 2242 myriads of years. But under their 10th king Xisuthros, as they called him, there was a great flood, and that Zarathustra, being warned by God, embarked in a ship with his wife and kindred and cattle, and that having been brought over in safety, as their story goes, to the mountains of Armenia, he offered sacrifices of thanksgiving to the gods after the flood. These writers have thus presented in a new form nearly all the ancient given by Moses, for men continued to live in the earth beyond the ocean. Oh, wow. 2,242 years of course of 10 generations, and under Noah, who was the 10th, the flood having occurred, they passed over to this earth by means of the ark. For Noah is he whom they call Xisuthros, but by having changed the days into years, they asserted that those 10 kings had lived 2,242 myriads of years, since the number of the years reckoned by Moses have elapsed from Adam to the deluge of Noah was 2,242 years. In like manner, the philosopher Timaeus also describes this earth as surrounded by the ocean, and the ocean is surrounded by more remote earth, for he supposes that there is to westward an island Atlantis lying out in the ocean in the direction of Gadria, Cadiz, of an enormous magnitude, and relates that the 10 kings having produced mercenaries from the nations in this island came from the earth far away, and conquered Europe and Asia, but were afterwards conquered by the Athenians, while that island itself was submerged by God under the sea. Look at that. Both Plato and Aristotle praise this philosopher, and Proclus has written a commentary on him. He himself expresses views similar to our own with some modifications, transferring the scene of the events from the east to the west. Moreover, he mentions those 10 generations, as well as that the earth which lies beyond the ocean, and in a word, it is evident that all of them borrow from Moses and publish his statements as their own. For the writers of Chaldean history as being more ancient and living farther east have mentioned in their works both the deluge and the building of the tower, since they saw that tower with their own eyes under the process of construction, being no doubt well aware that the men of that time, in fear of another flood, erected it for themselves as a place of refuge and safety. But the men of later times, when they had read Moses also, and found that Noah, in whose time the deluge occurred, was the 10th from Adam, in in whose time the deluge occurred was the 10th from Adam. They feigned I don't know that word. Sorry guys, I'm not the best reader in the world at all, by far. They feigned that they also had 10 kings who had reigned 2,242 myriads of years, as has already been said. Of these, the first was Aloris, that is Adam; the second Alaparus, Seth; the third Almedion, Enoch; and fourth Amaion, Canaan; and fifth Amergalaros, Malahalael; the sixth Donos, a keeper of sheep; Jared; the seventh Eurocos, Enoch; the eighth Amempsus, Methuselah; the ninth Oritolates, Lamech; the 10th Zairius, Noah. In his time, they say the great flood recorded by Moses occurred. The writers again, in his time, they say the great flood recorded by Moses occurred. The writers again of Egyptian history, namely Manetho and Cherimon, Apollonius, surnamed Molon, Lysias, and Apion, the grammarian, mention Moses, and the departure of the children of Israel from Egypt. For as being Egyptians and the historians of Egypt, they also agree in their relations of local transactions, and traduce Moses as a promoter of sedition, who stirred up a mob of rascally beggars and lepers, and say that these had gone away to Mount Sinai and Jerusalem, and were called Jews. And in a word, the Chaldeans and Egyptians, as being older older nations than the Greeks, testify in a manner to divine scriptures, asserting that both the deluge in the days of Noah did occur, that a tower was built, and that there was a departure of the children of Israel from Egypt. But the Greeks, who are later than these, and were later in learning the art of writing, and who are settled far away from the east, in regions of the west, and live far remote both from Judea and from Egypt, knew nothing about these events either by seeing them or hearing about them. Wherefore even unto this day they refuse to believe both. The New 378, 379. The Old and New Testament thinking that was the Old and the New Testament thinking that what they relate is fabulous. But the Chaldeans and the Medes and Persians have a somewhat wider knowledge, were instructed by the building of the tower and the deluge, and by what happened in the case of Hezekiah and Jonah, and by the captivity, and by Daniel and the three children, and also partly by the writings themselves. In like manner, also, the Egyptians were instructed by the affairs of Joseph and of Moses, and by the people of Israel, and these nations were thus better prepared for a ready acceptance of Christianity. Even the Greeks, however, did not believe later on through the apostles. Even the Greeks, however, did believe later on through the apostles, and they saw the wonders which they wrought. And when still later again signs ceased and time rolled on, you find Greeks who have believed and have been baptized, lapsing never nevertheless many of them into unbelief, and ignoring the Old and the New Testament, that is, divine scripture, as persons who have not had the root of religion and foundation of faith deeply implanted. Wherefore in their writings they have not mentioned, as the early Chaldeans and Egyptians have done, wherefore in their writings they have not mentioned, as the early Chaldeans and Egyptians have done, anything about the deluge and the building of the tower, and the departure of the children of Israel from Egypt, and about the first historian Moses. But though they regard themselves as very superior persons, and the wisest and foremost of men, they are nevertheless from their swelling vanity ignorant in many things. Wherefore one of the Egyptians, whose name was Solomon, said to Plato, "The Greeks are always children, and no Greek is ever old, nor is there any learning among you that is of hor that is of our hor iniquity. Yet some, for instance, Dias and Menander, who translated the antiquities of the Tyrians into the Greek language, in the works they composed bear testimony to Solomon and the Jews, and further the whole, I may almost say, of Ethiopia and the regions of the south of it, bear testimony to divine scripture. But the Greeks alone, who are wise in their own conceit, know not wherein their salvation lies. Timaeus alone, who has been already mentioned, drawing from what source I know not, but perhaps from the Chaldeans, recasts the story of those 10 kings, saying that they came from the earth, saying that they came from the earth beyond the ocean into the island of Atlantis, which he says was submerged below the sea, and that the king and that taking its inhabitants as mercenaries and arriving in this earth, they conquered Europe and Asia, all which is a most manifest invention, for as he could not point out the island, he gave out that God had consigned to a watery grave. But those Greeks already mentioned, who are admired who are admired for their wisdom, when at a late period they had acquired letters and had become possessed of laws, imagined that they alone had rained wisdom upon the world. I refer to their liturgices and their saloons and their teachers of Teucers, of the Locrians, and all the rest of them, who are but men of yesterday if put in comparison to the renowned Moses, in whose time not so much even as the name of law was known among the Greeks. Homer is my witness, who nowhere in his poetry uses the word, for there was not in his day such a thing, but the people were governed by the best judgments and the commands of their kings, and from that time till long afterwards they continued to use unwritten customs, and to alter many of them from time to time according to circumstances. For the Lacedaemonians and Cretans conducted education by the training of the habits and not by oral instructions, but the Athenians and nearly all the other nations prescribed by law what ought to be done. Uh, what ought to be done, while neglecting to accustom the people to conform in practice to the law, yet one nation after another made a gradual advance to the fixed and unauthoritative uh, and to a fixed and authoritative code of laws, not imposed from the beginning like that of Moses of old, who educated his nation in the knowledge of letters and of fixed law, being the first who showed both by word and deed the firm and permanent nature of the law and of letters until after a long course of time, he conducted the nations, guided and guarded by the firm nature of the law, to the predicted Lord Christ and his teaching. The Phoenicians, accordingly, being next neighbors to the Jews, and having learned letters from them, both wrote inscription earlier than the Greeks, and prepared the Greeks to learn letters. For Cadmus, taking the letters of the alphabet from Tyre, carried them into Greece. Let not the Greeks then show any supercilious pride, as if they had been the first to invent anything new of benefit to the world, seeing that they have borrowed from others letters and laws and the notation of the sphere and astronomy. Okay, that's very important to see here. Let not the Greeks then show any supercilious pride, as if they had been the first to invent anything new of benefit to the world, seeing that they have borrowed from others letters, laws, and the notion of the sphere and astronomy. They're saying, don't let anybody tell you that the Greeks invented all this stuff because they borrowed everything from everybody. They borrowed the alphabet and how to write and do things because they were originally doing it with habits. Then they borrowed the laws and then they wanted to make their own laws. That's how you can read in all the books of the Maccabees how they consistently made efforts at trying to get people to go against the laws of the Most High, but some people would rather choose death than break the law of God. And then they're also the ones that borrowed the reverse engineered information that people throughout time seem to be admitting we had assistance on forming, you know. Seems like a lot of this, the maths and presumptions inserted about the cosmology in which we actually live has been given to us by a higher authority or beings that have a higher knowledge of where we are. But let us continue. And astrology. That's astronomy and astrology. Okay? Those are two different studies. For as it was late before they made and figure in the world, they imagined the world to be eternal, having been taught by others to regard the heaven as a sphere. They, as if they were the first who held this opinion, claimed as a discovery of their own the laws of astronomy. And although they were taught letters by the suppose they were taught letters by others, they suppose themselves to be the oldest and earliest writers, although they have been taught by others to frame laws. They have depicted others, they have depicted themselves as the legislators of old times and founders of just government. Isn't that like it is today? Every time you want to talk about something, they always, if you want to go to the root of something, the etymology of something, it always starts at the Greeks. Isn't that funny though, that there's multiple things that say that Hebrew, if I'm not mistaken, Paleo Hebrew was the first language, and that was given to Yah's people because it was the language of the heavenly realms. Isn't that funny? Isn't that a coincidence? It's funny how these books just start showing up and they've been here for so long, but you never find them unless the Spirit leads you to them, right? That's really funny. Although they have received a copious language and an elegant wait. Laws themselves and depicted themselves as the legislators of old times and founders of just government. Although they have received a copious language and an elegant mode of speech from the bounty of God, yet, being unthankful to God the giver, they are disobedient to his words, and while they receive everything from God and their predecessors, they set them aside and with swaggering insolence ascribe everything to themselves. For contending against the divine words, which say, He that established the heavens as a vault. These most superior persons cry out in opposition and say, It is not so, for it is spherical, and that is manifest from the eclipses which we have already adduced, which we have already adduced. But further, when they hear the resurrection preached to them, they pronounce this to be impossible. For how, say they, can one who has been used up from countless bodies in succession rise up? And to be brief, they attack with sophistries the giver of their speech in their endeavor to overthrow the doctrines of his church. And yet he has not left them without a witness to himself that he was working for their good and taking thought for it beforehand. For he manifested to them some tokens of his goodness, some 400 years or more, before the coming of Christ in the days of Alexander the Macedonian, long after the Trojan War, when the Greeks were still flourishing. Let me give an instance of this. Okay, so it's talking about like how they seem like they were favored, but everything they do with an arrogance and pride, and look, guys, we could really go into where a lot of this pride comes from, because when you start linking all the bloodlines to where a lot of these Nephilims, or not even so much the Nephilims, but the descendants of the Nephilims, and these like some of the things and giants, like not every offspring is a half angel, half giant, or half angel, half human woman, you know? Not everyone was born from that. To like Achilles. Achilles, okay, we're getting too far off topic. I don't want to do that. The point is a lot of their success was not unseen, and it was extremely quick, and it also points back to having some very crazy strong warriors that existed within their time that were born of the lineages of the fallen. Okay, so think about that. So all this stuff that they always want to teach about Greek and Roman mythology doesn't necessarily mean that it's all that real. Some of it might sound and seem exaggerated, but once you actually really, I mean, come on, guys. You realize that we're not on a ball. You realize that this whole place was created. Like, everything goes out the window now. You don't even have the right to say that there is no such thing as fiction, because you're realizing that you truly are living in a, in what your reality is more intense than anything that they could ever think of as fiction. That's why everything that they give you to entertain you with is based off of is given that label of fiction, but it's all based and rooted in the ancient ways. They just cherry pick from different cultures, but it's all coming back to the same story, which is the story of the Holy Scriptures, the Creator, and the process and all the stuff that went down after He created and sent into the world and all this stuff, man. It's like we have a plane of existence, there's two planes of existence under us, there's like seven planes of existence above us. All these angels, there's different races of angels. Like they have their different types of angels, they have their different cultures, they have their, I mean, it's all the culture of worshiping the Most High, but they have their different areas, they have their own worlds up there, like mountain ranges, they have their own gardens and places of residence, you know? They have their own tasks and jobs. Let Yah be praised. Let me give an instance with this. When Alexander the Macedonian was passing by Jerusalem in prosecution of his war against Darius, the high priest of the Jews, arrayed in the robes of his office, came forth to meet him. Whereupon Alexander dismounted from his horse and in a very kindly manner embraced him. And when his attendants reproached him for doing so, and said, Why hast thou done so? He excused himself, and said, When I set out at first from Macedonia, a man dressed in this style was seen by me in a dream, who said to me, Go forth and conquer. The result was that the king himself offered sacrifices to God, and bestowed many gifts on the temple, and accorded and accorded many privileges to the country of the Jews. In subsequent times, Ptolemy, surnamed Philadelphus, after having made careful inquiry from Tryphon, the Phalarian, about the Jewish books, and learned the truth concerning them, earnestly solicited them from the high priest Eleazar, to whom, as well as the temple, he sent many presents. These books he received along the 70 elderly men who translated them from Hebrew into Greek tongue, and he deposited them on the shelves of his own library. This also was a work of divine providence, that the translation had been prepared before the coming of Christ, lest if it were done afterwards, in the days of the apostles, it would be exposed to general suspicion, as if they had interpreted what had been said of old by the prophets, both concerning Christ and the calling of the Gentiles, in a way to suit their own predilections, predilec- predilections. When Ptolemy Physcon again had conquered the Jews, and wished to destroy those here in Alexandria by means of his elephants, but God had unexpectedly turned the rage of the animals against his soldiery. He was taught to revere God, and he honored thereafter with sacrifices and oblations of gifts him who was the true God, and his people, namely the Jews, and other kings of the Macedonian Empire. There were who invited them to be their allies in war, while others again who preferred to war against them and held them under subjection for a long time afterwards, witnessed Providence turning to work in their favor, and aroused for their help, and even saw themselves conquered by men who were insignificant and in few number. Wow. That's when you start thinking about it, like a lot of these, how Yah always uses small numbers of armies to handle situations. And then also, like that movie, like 300, you know, interesting. And to speak briefly, they were trained by wars and miracles. Excuse me. And to speak briefly, they were trained by wars and miracles, and dreams, and their sacred books, and were thus taught to know him who was truly God, him whom the Jews revere and worship, in order that they also be the better prepared for the reception of Christianity, so that, At the time when the Lord sojourned upon the earth, many nations of Greece, seeing the signs wrought by the apostles, assented to the faith of Christ, confessing his resurrection and his ascension into heaven. But now, after a long lapse of time and the cessation of signs, they have fallen into a sort of oblivion of that faith, and have reverted to the former superstition, declaring it impossible that there can be a resurrection of the dead and an ascent into heaven. Wherefore, you find them observing baptism and yet thinking that the heaven has a spherical form, in order that the resurrection of their bodies and their ascension into heaven may be denied. These men find dis- will mostly find discussing philosophy with the pagans alone, and setting forth eclipses as arguments to prove the world of a spherical figure, as if they were a divine doctrine, in themselves deceived while they deceive others. Wherefore we, by undertaking to exhibit the figures and the places of the whole world and the revolution of the heavenly bodies, controvert their views from divine scripture, doing our best by means of all these. Oh, you know what? I think that there was some notes saying that this one book was cut off or incompleted or something like that, or they probably just didn't want to include it. Who knows what happened there? But okay, so that's that, and I'll do a separate video for the appendix because there's some interesting looking things in there.